12 years. That's how long this moment has been building. 12 years of occupation. 12 years of Ukrainian families watching strangers patrol their streets, tear down their signs, rename their town. 12 years of the world shrugging and saying, that's just how it is now. Well, that's not how it is anymore. Because right now, in the spring of 2026, something is happening in Crimea that the Kremlin cannot spin, cannot hide, and, crucially, cannot stop. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the naval force that anchored Moscow's grip on this peninsula for over 2 centuries, has been chased out of Sevastopol. The Crimean Bridge, Putin's $4 billion symbol of conquest, has been struck 3 times and is running out of luck. The supply lines feeding Russian troops on the peninsula are being severed, one by one, with surgical precision, and the soldiers Russia left behind are growing more isolated, more undersupplied, and more desperate with every single week that passes. This is not speculation. Every one of those facts is confirmed by satellite imagery, by military intelligence, and by analysts on both sides of this war. So here's the question that matters. How did Ukraine get here? How does a country with no navy sink one of the world's most storied fleets? How does an army fighting along a 600-mile front line simultaneously engineer the slow-motion collapse of an occupied peninsula hundreds of kilometers away? That is exactly what we're going to break down, piece by piece, chapter by chapter, because this is the story of 12 years of patience, planning, and quiet brilliance finally paying off. And it starts with a theft. It was February 2014. Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, was on fire, politically speaking. Mass protests had just toppled the country's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. The new government was scrambling to establish control. Institutions were in flux. The military chain of command was confused. The country was, in the most vulnerable sense of the word, distracted, and Putin saw his window. Within days, not weeks, days, unmarked soldiers began appearing across Crimea. No insignia, no flags, just weapons, discipline, and a clear mission. The world would later call them Little Green Men. They moved fast, seizing the regional parliament building in Sevastopol before most people had even woken up. They surrounded Ukrainian military bases, cut communications, and made it impossible for Kyiv's forces to coordinate a response. By the time the international community processed what was even happening, it was already over. The entire operation took less than 4 weeks. An entire region, 27,000 square kilometers, home to 2.4 million people, absorbed into Russia through a combination of military intimidation, a hastily organized referendum that no credible international observer recognized as legitimate, and the sheer speed of the operation itself. It was, in purely operational terms, brilliantly executed, cold-blooded, calculated, and completely illegal under international law. But here's what made Crimea worth stealing in the first place. Because Putin didn't do this for sentimental reasons alone, though he would later describe Crimea as a sacred and inseparable part of Russia. He did it because of what Crimea represents geopolitically. Putin himself once called the peninsula an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and that description, as theatrical as it sounds, is genuinely accurate. From Crimea, specifically from the port city of Sevastopol, Russia can project military power across the entire Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, and as far as the Middle East. The surrounding waters sit atop substantial oil and gas reserves. Critical trade routes pass through the region, and Sevastopol itself has been home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet for 240 years. A fleet that represents not just military capability, but historical prestige and national identity. In short, Putin didn't just steal a piece of land. He stole a weapons platform, a forward operating base, a projection of power into some of the most geopolitically contested waters on Earth. And for 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, he used it exactly that way. He turned Crimea into a staging ground. He funneled troops, missiles, and equipment onto the peninsula. He launched the 2022 full-scale invasion partly from Crimea's southern flank, using it to bombard Ukrainian cities with missile strikes and artillery barrages. He thought he'd secured it forever. He was wrong. Here's something that often gets lost in the day-to-day noise of battlefield updates and ceasefire rumors. Ukraine never, not for a single day, accepted the loss of Crimea. While Western governments hemmed and hawed about diplomatic solutions, and while some voices quietly suggested Ukraine should be realistic and move on, Kyiv's military commanders were doing something entirely different. They were planning, patiently, methodically, and with a level of strategic discipline that would only become fully apparent years later. From the first day of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, the message from Ukraine's military leadership was unambiguous: Crimea will come home. But they were smart enough to know that those weren't words you back up with a single dramatic assault. They were words you back up with years of careful, targeted, incremental action, and that's exactly what they did. The first strikes came just months into the war. Ukrainian drone crews, operating improvised sea drones that barely existed as a concept a year earlier, began appearing in Sevastopol harbor. Explosions rocked the Crimean Bridge. Russian commanders, who had assumed the peninsula was a safe and untouchable rear base, suddenly found themselves scanning the skies. The message was clear: nowhere in Crimea is safe. Then came the systematic destruction of Russia's air defenses. This was the part of Ukraine's strategy that most people underestimate. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make for explosive headlines, but knocking out air defense systems, one by one, over months and years, is what eventually makes everything else possible. Because without air defenses, Crimea becomes exposed, open to attack at any time, from any direction, with no protection. Ukraine picked them off with extraordinary patience. S-400 batteries, Panzer systems, radar installations. Each one hit, each one degraded, each one making the next strike a little easier than the last. And then there were the larger, more dramatic operations. The ones that reminded the world that Ukraine wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back with genuine ferocity. In September 2023, Ukraine launched what became known as Operation Crab Trap. A salvo of British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles flew low over the Black Sea and struck directly into the headquarters building of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. The building, a fortified Soviet-era structure that Russia had considered essentially impenetrable, was destroyed. Reports confirmed more than 30 officers killed and over 100 wounded in a single strike. The admiral commanding the fleet was reportedly among those injured. Think about what that means. In one afternoon, Ukraine wiped out a significant portion of the Russian Black Sea Fleet's entire senior command structure. In one afternoon, the Crimean Bridge also continued to suffer. Ukraine hit it in October 2022, causing a dramatic partial collapse that was broadcast worldwide. Hit it again in July 2023. And then in June 2025, Ukrainian intelligence operatives planted 1,100 kilograms of explosives directly on the bridge's underwater structural supports and detonated them at 4:44 in the morning. The images of that explosion traveled around the world by breakfast. 3 strikes and counting. All the while, Ukraine was doing something else, something even more strategically important than any individual operation. It was building an entire domestic defense industry from scratch. At the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was almost entirely dependent on Western weapons deliveries. By 2026, the country had hundreds of domestic defense contractors developing everything from long-range strike drones to new air defense systems. Companies that didn't exist 3 years ago are now producing weapons that are actively shaping the battlefield. The world watched Ukraine fight. What it didn't fully see was Ukraine building. And that building, quiet, relentless, and remarkably effective, is a big part of why 2026 feels so different from every year that came before it. Now we get to the part of this story that genuinely should be studied in military academies for the next 100 years. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, one of the oldest and most storied naval forces on the planet, with roots going back to 1783, has been effectively destroyed by a country with no navy. Let that sit for a second. Ukraine has no aircraft carriers, no destroyers, no fleet submarines. At the start of this war, its naval capability was so limited it barely registered on the global scale. And yet, using low-cost, remotely operated sea drones, some reportedly costing as little as $250,000 to build, Ukrainian operators have sunk or severely damaged over 30 Russian naval vessels. The math is almost absurd. Russia's flagship, the cruiser Moskva, was worth an estimated $750 million. It was sunk in April 2022 by 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles. The ship that was supposed to be the symbol of Russian naval dominance in the Black Sea slipped beneath the waves in under an hour. Russia initially tried to deny it happened. They couldn't. What followed was a systematic campaign of attrition, unlike anything seen in modern naval warfare. The Caesar Kunikov, a landing ship capable of transporting tanks and troops, hit by a sea drone in February 2024. The Ivanovets, a missile corvette worth around $60 million, sunk in the same year. Patrol boats, minesweepers, supply vessels, all gone. By late 2025, satellite imagery was telling a story that Russian state media refused to acknowledge. Sevastopol harbor, once packed with gray warships, was almost empty. The fleet had retreated to Novorossiysk, a port on the Russian mainland, hundreds of kilometers away, where it sheltered behind anti-drone nets and defensive barriers, hoping Ukraine's sea drones couldn't reach it there. They could. In February 2026, Ukraine launched a coordinated 200-drone strike on Novorossiysk that left the port in flames. There is no safe harbor left for what remains of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Then, in April 2026, Ukraine hit what the fleet had left in Crimea itself. Drones struck the Streletsky Bay Command Center in Sevastopol, the facility responsible for coordinating the movement of every remaining Black Sea vessel. The same week, 2 large landing ships still stationed in Sevastopol Bay were attacked. The Yamal, capable of carrying 500 tons of cargo, including armored vehicles, valued at over $80 million, and the Nikolai Filchenkov, even larger, capable of transporting up to 1,000 tons of equipment and troops, both hit in one night. General David Petraeus, former CIA director and one of the most decorated American military figures of the modern era, called Ukraine's naval campaign sheer genius. And he was right, because this wasn't just about sinking ships. Every ship sunk was a logistics platform removed. Every vessel destroyed was one less way to reinforce, supply, or evacuate Russian forces in Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet wasn't just a military asset, it was a supply chain, and Ukraine methodically dismantled it, piece by piece, over 4 years. The sea route to Crimea is now effectively closed. With the sea route closed, Russia has 2 remaining ways to supply its forces in Crimea: the Crimean Bridge across the Kerch Strait, and the overland land corridor running through occupied southern Ukraine, through Zaporizhia and Kherson, down into the peninsula. Ukraine is targeting both, simultaneously, relentlessly. Think of those supply lines as the veins of an organism. Block them, and it doesn't matter how many soldiers you have on the peninsula, how many guns, how many missiles. Without fuel, without food, without ammunition, the organism dies. Not dramatically, not overnight, but inevitably. On the night of April 5th, 2026, Ukrainian special forces used drones to disable the Slavyanin, the last Russian railway ferry still operating across the Kerch Strait. These ferries had been the quiet workhorses of Russia's Crimea supply operation, moving military equipment and ammunition across the water below the radar of international attention. With the Slavyanin gone, every single railway ferry that Russia operated across the Kerch Strait has now been destroyed, damaged, or disabled. That route is closed. The Crimean Bridge remains, but it is under constant pressure. Ukraine has struck it 3 times. Every convoy that crosses it now does so under the shadow of Ukrainian drone surveillance. Every truck driver knows they are being watched. Every military commander knows that a 4th strike could come at any moment, and this time, Ukraine has longer range, more precise weapons than it did in any of the previous 3 attacks. And on the land corridor, the overland route through occupied southern Ukraine that Russia has quietly relied on as a backup, Ukraine spent an entire week in April 2026 systematically dismantling the infrastructure that makes it function. 3 Russian arsenals destroyed, 3 supply depots hit, 2 logistics coordination hubs attacked. These weren't random strikes. They were a coordinated campaign against the nervous system of Russia's southern supply network. Here's what that means in practical terms. Picture a Russian supply convoy driver on that southern corridor. He's driving through occupied Zaporizhia. It's 3 a.m. Above him, somewhere in the dark, Ukrainian drones are circling. He can't see them. He can't hear them at this altitude. But he knows they're there because 3 convoys in the past month were hit on this exact road. His orders are to deliver ammunition to a depot near Armyansk. His radio crackles. His palms are sweaty. He might make it. But the odds are getting worse every week. Meanwhile, Russia has begun doing something that tells you everything you need to know about the state of its Crimea garrison. It has started pulling troops out of the peninsula and sending them to active frontline combat zones. Naval infantry units, mobilized troops, stripped directly from Crimea's defenses and shipped north because the Kremlin is so desperate for manpower elsewhere that it's willing to leave the peninsula even more exposed. That is not the behavior of a power in control. That is the behavior of a power that is running out of everything: soldiers, supplies, and options. Everything we've described, the fleet destroyed, the supply lines cut, the peninsula slowly isolated, this didn't all happen because Ukraine got lucky. It happened because 2026 is the year when the balance of power in this war fundamentally shifted. Start with Ukraine's battlefield position. In February 2026, for the first time since 2023, Ukrainian forces retook more land than they lost in a single month. Since late January, Ukraine had liberated over 400 square kilometers of occupied territory, and Russian advances, which had been grinding slowly forward for most of 2024 and 2025, had stalled almost completely. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed something extraordinary. Ukraine had achieved drone superiority over Russian forces along significant portions of the front line, not just parity. Superiority. On the political front, Ukraine received an enormous boost when Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, the last meaningful pro-Russian voice inside the European Union and NATO, suffered a crushing defeat in the April 12th parliamentary elections. Orban had spent months blocking a massive €90 billion EU loan to Ukraine. With him gone, that money is coming, and when it arrives, it accelerates everything: weapons production, drone manufacturing, ammunition procurement, military salaries. The entire engine of Ukraine's war effort gets a turbo injection. Now look at the other side of the ledger. Russia is losing tens of thousands of soldiers every month, killed, wounded, or captured. Its recruitment numbers are falling while its casualty rate climbs. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia was consistently unable to bring in enough new soldiers to replace those it was losing. Its army is not just taking casualties, it is shrinking. Russian equipment losses are similarly staggering. Thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft destroyed over 4 years of war, many of them irreplaceable, pulled from decades-old Soviet-era stockpiles that are running dry. Russia's defense industry is working around the clock, but it cannot replace losses as fast as Ukraine is inflicting them. And politically, Putin has never been more isolated. With Orban gone, his last ally inside Western institutions has vanished. His diplomatic options are narrowing. His economy is under severe strain from sanctions. Even some of Russia's own military bloggers, the hardline nationalists who were once his most vocal cheerleaders, are now quietly asking uncomfortable questions about where this war is heading. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who spent nearly 4 decades in the United States Army and commanded all American forces in Europe, has watched all of this unfold. And his assessment is direct. Crimea, he says, is the decisive terrain of this war, not the Donbass, not Kherson, Crimea. He explains it simply. The ability to project power across the Black Sea really comes from Crimea, and he believes Ukraine should and will keep escalating pressure on the peninsula. More strikes on airfields, more attacks on air defenses. And about the Crimean Bridge, he is unambiguous. That big bridge is eventually going to come down. When it does, the game changes completely. So how does this end? What does the liberation of Crimea actually look like when it arrives? It probably doesn't look like a cinematic D-Day. It's unlikely to be one single dramatic moment. Tanks rolling into Simferopol, a Ukrainian flag raised over Sevastopol harbor in front of cheering crowds. The reality will be stranger, and in some ways, more fascinating than that. What Ukraine is engineering is a strategic collapse. Not a conquest, a collapse. Phase 1 is already underway. Isolate the peninsula completely. Cut the sea routes. Destroy the ferry crossings. Degrade the bridge. Attack the overland corridors. Make Crimea more expensive and more dangerous to hold than to abandon. Phase 2 will likely be the bridge. Ukraine has already proven it can hit it. It has more capable weapons today than it did in any of the first 3 strikes. The 4th strike, when it comes, could be the decisive one. If significant sections of that bridge come down, the Russian troops remaining in Crimea lose their most reliable supply line and their most psychologically important connection to the mainland. The isolation becomes total. Phase 3 would see Ukrainian ground forces push south through Zaporizhia or Kherson, threatening the land bridge itself. If that corridor is broken, Crimea becomes a true island, Geographically, it always was. Now, it becomes one militarily and logistically too. And at that point, the Russian commanders on the peninsula face a question that has no good answer. Fight on in a fortress with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no escape, or negotiate. History says they would fight, but history also said the Black Sea Fleet would never leave Sevastopol. History said the Crimean Bridge was untouchable. History said Ukraine couldn't survive a full-scale Russian invasion, let alone turn it around. Ukraine has made a habit of proving history wrong. In 2014, Putin stood before the world and declared Crimea was Russia's forever. He said it with the confidence of a man who had never truly expected to be challenged. He called it sacred. He called it inseparable. He built a $4 billion bridge to cement the connection. Today, that bridge has been hit 3 times. The fleet he anchored there has been destroyed. The soldiers he stationed there are being stripped away for use elsewhere. And the analysts, including his own, are running out of convincing arguments that Russia can hold the peninsula indefinitely. 12 years ago, this moment seemed impossible. Right now, it feels inevitable. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening in Crimea, share it, because most people have no idea how close we are to one of the most significant territorial reversals in modern European history. Subscribe for the next chapter, because this story is far from over.